Cascading style sheets or CSS is a style sheet language popular for making website look pretty. So for example, we have this website here. You can see there are some hover effects and other stylings which are done in CSS. Now what if I remove the CSS? So you can see the browser is now rendering only the HTML documentation. So this is what CSS does to a page. It is used to make website look beautiful in a presentable way by adding various styling options like the color, spacing between words or letters, spacing between elements, even modifying the font and its size, or adding borders, maybe changing the background, and much more. CSS can be used to define different stylings and layout variations of your web page. This is why it is known as style sheet. Why is it cascading? That I will discuss as we move along with this section. So now let's begin understanding CSS in a practical way. The first way I'm going to show you is inline styling. That's how you apply the CSS. Inline styles are a type of CSS styling which you can use inside your HTML tag itself. It's an easy way for you to start using styles inside HTML. So here I have defined very basic and simple HTML code. Let's start adding styles to it, and for that you just have to pick the tag and give the attribute style inside them. Like here, let's say I want to change the color of this heading. So inside the h1 tag, I will give style attribute like this, and you can see various styling names are being displayed. So inside these quotation marks, you can give the name of CSS attribute that you want to style along with the value for that attribute. For giving the color, I will use the color attribute and I will give the value. So this is how the syntax looks like for applying inline styling inside any HTML element. Now if you look at the output, you can see the heading color has changed. The syntax for defining the style looks something like this. We have the tag name, the style attribute, then we have the property name, colon, value, and then we end that with a semicolon. Now if you have new property, you add another property after the semicolon, and this goes on. Now let's try to apply multiple styles inside a single tag. For example, I want to align this heading to the center, so I'll give the text align attribute. This attribute is used to modify the text alignments. So you can see various alignment options are displayed. I'll select center, and now the heading is aligned to the center. Let's also apply some styling to this paragraph as well. I will again use the style attribute and will give the color and font size. Now you can use these font size options, or you can manually define the size. I'll choose the font size right now and let's check the output. So you can add as many of these CSS attributes inside the style as you want. I've just shown some most commonly used attributes, and not only to the tags which are defined inside the body, but you can also apply CSS attributes to the body tag as well. Let's say for example, I want to change the background color of this body. So I'll give style inside body and will apply the background color attribute to change the background of the body. And you see the background is changed. So these are just the basic ways you can start with by applying styling with the inline way, that is applying the style attribute with the tag itself. So there is one question here that what is inline styling? So basically giving the style attribute along with the tag name is called as the inline style or the inline CSS. So now you know how to apply the styling with inline way. Now let's take one step further. In this lecture, I am discussing how to define internal styling. Before we move on to the style tag or internal styling, let me show you example why the need arises to apply internal styling rather than just going with inline styling. So here I have defined an H1, and let's say I want to apply multiple styles to this H1. That is color, font style, size and border. All these stylings for a single element. Now imagine you have multiple elements and you have to give multiple styling to each of these elements. You can imagine how messy the code will get and will be even tough to modify any of those styling attributes. So that's why inline styling is not a preferred choice when you want to apply multiple CSS attributes. Only for applying fewer attributes you can go with inline styling. So we do have a different approach, and that is the internal styling approach. Let's take a look at that. Here I have given a header, a paragraph and a link. Now to apply internal styling to the HTML document, we use the style tag. So all the styling attributes which you will apply to your HTML document can be written inside the style tag. Let me show you how. I will say style tag here inside the head tag. Remember, the style tag is always defined inside the head tag. Why? Because the head tag contains the metadata about the HTML document. So the style tag comes under that category. This kind of styling is also known as embedded styling. So the style sheet will affect the document they are embedded in. Alright, so next step is to define the styling, and we do that by giving the selector name like this. Let's say I want to apply styling to the body. So I will give body here and then opening the curly brackets, and now I apply the CSS attribute here. Let's also apply styling to rest of the HTML elements. I'll say here H1 opening the curly brackets, and let me add few stylings. Similarly for paragraph, I'll say P here and we'll give styling inside the paragraph. Now for the link, I'll say A here and we'll apply the color, font size and font style. You can change the default look of the link too by giving styling to them. Let's check the output, and you can see that the stylings are applied. We have used the internal styling approach, that is by using the style tag. It is called internal styling because we define or embed the style tag within the HTML document. You can also define CSS in a separate .css file known as external styling, which is our next topic. In this lecture, I am going to discuss one more approach for applying CSS, and that is external styling, where the CSS is defined in separate .css file and then it is included or imported or embedded with a link tag inside your HTML document. So as we saw in the last lecture, we have applied internal styling by using the style tag inside HTML document. But you generally see huge CSS code, and putting it in HTML is also not a good practice. It's a good practice to divide your CSS code into not only one but several CSS files, and then you make those CSS files available to the HTML where you are using it. Now we are going to use the external styling approach, and for that what I'll do is I'll create a separate file for CSS like this. You can give any name to it, but do remember to give the .css as a file extension. So now you can see we have a CSS file open here. Inside this, I'll apply all the CSS stylings which are inside the style tag. So I'll cut all these stylings and only the stylings, not the style tag, as we have created a separate file now for CSS, and I'll paste it here. Now if we check the output, you can see the styling is gone. The reason is that you need to make the CSS file available in the HTML, and for that I'll use the link tag inside the head tag. Now here in the index HTML file, I'll give a link tag. Now when I press enter after typing link, you can see it shows two attributes defined inside. The rel attribute shows the relationship between the linked file, which we will give here in the href, and the HTML document. So right now you see that it is showing the relation as style sheet. So mostly the link tag will be used to embed the CSS file inside the HTML document. And inside the href, that is the link reference, I will give the CSS file name, which is styles.css. And you can see the moment I start typing the CSS file name, it starts showing me the name already. Alright, now the CSS is linked with this document. Let's save this, go to the browser and refresh, and you see that the styling is back, but this time it is not inside the HTML document but defined in a separate CSS file. So this way is called as applying the external styling. Let's talk about a relative question. So how do you embed the external CSS file to your HTML document? So it's the link tag which helps you to embed the CSS inside your HTML document. Let's now talk about the CSS selectors. They are used to target HTML elements on the web pages which we want to style. Selectors are basically the way we apply CSS. There are a wide variety of selectors like element, class, ID, group, universal, and much more in fact. The first selector I am discussing in this lecture is the element selector. Element selector in CSS is used to select HTML elements which are to be styled. The syntax for element selector looks like this. You have the element name. In the curly brackets, you give list of CSS property, which we have already seen in fact. So for example, if I want to add styling to this h1 on the page, then it will look something like this. Here h1 is the element selector. This we have already seen as we have used this approach in many of our previous topics. So this is actually called as the element selector. Now if you have three headings like this and want to add similar styling to them, so rather than defining stylings for individual heading, you can write like this. Let's say h2, color, font size, text align, family and decoration, and this will apply the styling to all the h2 tags in the HTML document. Here are few more examples of element selectors. I have the division, body, unordered list, and let's say list li. So this is what an element selector is. In the next lecture, we will look at the class selector. Now let's talk about a relative question. So what is element selector? When it comes to selecting the element to apply the CSS, one of the selector is element selector, which basically refers the element, that is the HTML element or tag name, to apply the CSS, like h1, h2, paragraph, li, division, body, and so on. In this lecture, I am discussing about class selector. Let's first of all understand a scenario. I have defined an HTML document like this, where I have 3 paragraphs, 2 headings, and 2 subheadings. Now let's say you want to add style to the paragraph. So basically you will use the element selector and will give the stylings. So now in the browser, you see that all the paragraphs from the document share the same styling, which is kind of obvious because that's what the element selector does. But let's say if I want to apply styles to the first paragraph and its respective heading. Well, in that case, element selector won't work. We have a bunch of rules now which you can apply to create custom styles. Think of this as an example. If you want to create a website and you want that different elements or maybe similar elements should share that custom style which you have defined. Now instead of element selector, I will define a custom class name. So I will remove this P, that is element selector, and will give any suitable name, let's say my style. But this my style is a custom entity. We have to inform the browser that this is a class, and for that we begin the class name with a dot. Now the class is ready, and to apply it we use the class attribute. For example, I want to apply the class on this paragraph. Now when I check the browser, you can see the styles are added to the paragraph like we wanted. Now if I want this same styling to be applied on the H2, then I'll simply give the same class name inside H2 like this. And now you can see the heading and paragraph share the same styling. So this is the advantage of using the class selector. You can define your own custom style, and that you can apply to many different elements. Like here, if I want to add this styling to H3, I'll simply give the similar class name here as well. And now you can see the H3 and paragraph has same styling applied. There is a shorthand way to define class inside any element in a single go, and for that, let's say I want to define H1 with class attribute. So you can write like this, H1 dot and the name of the class. I will press enter and you can see the element is created with the class attribute. Now let's talk about a relative question. The question is, when will you use the class selector? So as we discussed that when we have bunch of rules to be applied on various types of elements, then we use the class. Class is basically the custom style you define on any element with the help of using the class attribute. I am further continuing with the class selector lecture, and there is one more concept which I want to discuss, and that is the element.class selector. So as you can see in the code, I have divided the contents inside div tags. Now what if a situation arises where you have given the same class names to multiple elements like this, but want to select or target only the specific element? So right now if I use the class selector, this will apply styling to all the elements having the class name my style, correct? But let's say I want to apply this styling to only a particular element despite other elements sharing the same class name. Let's say I want to apply styling to this div. So for that I will use this syntax, that is element.class selector. As you can see now, the styling is applied to the div element. If I open the developer tool here, you can see the elements sharing the same class name. When I move to styles, you can see it displays the check marks which indicates that the CSS style sheet is applied. Now when I move to the elements sharing the same class name, you can see it shows the user agent style sheet, which is default style sheet provided by the browser itself. So the style sheet won't be applied here despite the fact that they have the same class name. So when we give the element dot class selector, it tells the browser to select the element which is having that particular class name. So this is what the use of element dot class selector is. If I change this div to p here, then among all the paragraphs defined in the document, it's going to target the paragraph having the class name. Alright, so now we will be discussing about the ID selector. ID selector is used to apply styling to a unique element on the page. So consider a scenario where we want a set of rules to be applied on a unique element inside the HTML document. So when the element is unique throughout the whole HTML page, we assign that element with an ID attribute. And to access that element, we use the ID selector. Here with div, I'm going to say the attribute ID is equal to my ID. Just like class selector, we give the ID name here, but giving the name is not enough to access the ID attribute. That's why we begin with a hash sign when we want to give the ID selector. So here I say hash my ID. Now if you look at the browser, you can see the styling is applied. Remember, if you give the same ID to multiple elements, the browser won't give any error, but it is the developer's job to follow the standard practices. There is also a shorthand to define ID inside any element in a single go, and for that, let's say I want to define h1 with ID, so I will write h1 hash and the ID name. I'll press enter, and now you see the element is created with the ID attribute. The relative question is, explain the difference between ID and class selector. So the class selector we apply to multiple types of elements. ID selector we do apply to maybe a paragraph or a division or an h1 or any other element, but at a time we prefer to have only one ID for each page. As I mentioned, if you give same ID to multiple elements, the browser will not give any error, but that's not the practice one should follow. When you say ID, that means it has to be a unique ID. And the ID selector CSS means you are applying few CSS rules meant only for that unique element. Grouping of elements sharing the same styling is made easy with the help of group selector approach. Group selector is nothing but to select multiple elements in a group with the element selector and style them together. Consider this example. I want to apply similar styling to all these elements, so rather than giving individual styling to them and copy paste those styling options, I will simply group them together like this. I'll say article, paragraph, and also my division, which is a class. So you see that there is an element selector and a class selector together, and I have grouped them together. So you can see all the elements now share the similar styling. Thus, grouping of elements is a very effective and time saver approach when you want elements to share the same styling attributes. Now let's talk about a question. Can you group elements and class selectors together? Certainly you can. As we saw earlier in this code, we have tried to group elements as well as the class selector. There are a few set of rules and styling which you want to define as global setting for the page. In such case, you can use the universal selector. When there is no styling applied to elements, styles defined in the universal selector will be applied. So now let's try universal selector practically. You see this code. Now here if I want to add styling to all the elements, I will say asterisk and will open the curly bracket like this. Universal selector is denoted by an asterisk sign, and it is used to select any and all types of elements in an HTML document. Let me add some styling here. So this is how the syntax looks like when working with universal selector. You have the asterisk and you give the property and value and you keep on adding such CSS properties. Now when giving only the asterisk sign, it will select all the elements of the document as you can see. But if we give a particular element with an asterisk sign, then it will select only that element. So here if I say P with an asterisk, then the style will get applied to the paragraphs. If I add a span here and want to give styling to only the span, then I will simply add span here. We'll also change the font style. Similarly, for division, if I add another division tag in the document and want to apply style to all the divisions, then I'll say asterisk and div. So you can see stylings are applied to both the divisions. This is how you can work with universal selector. It's very useful and effective as well. As we move ahead, you will have a clear idea when will you use the universal selector as well. So what is the purpose of universal selector? We use the asterisk and we define the styling. Whatever styling you define with universal selector is generally a set of style which you want to apply when there is no other styling applied. In a web page, generally we see that there are few padding or margin for all elements by default you want to apply. In such case, universal selector is also very useful. So you have learned how to apply styles to HTML elements. Now is the perfect time to know about the CSS specificity. It's all about CSS priority. Think of a specificity like this. If there are two or more CSS attributes defined for the same element, the selector with the highest priority or specificity value will get the preference and its style declaration will be applied to that HTML element. For example, if I have a header and two paragraphs defined inside an HTML document like this, let's try to add style to this H1 using the element selector. I'll say H1. Let me give color red, the font size, let's say 3EM, and font family cursive. So you can see the styles are applied to only the header, that is the H1. Now if I want to access this same H1 with class attribute and with different styles too, so for that I will define a class here and will apply some new styling to it. Let me just say class is equal to my header. Now also defining the class, I'll say dot my header, color let's say blue, font size small, and font family Courier new and this option. Okay. Now you can see that the H1 is displayed with the new styles despite already defining H1 with element selector. If I click inspect element here, you can see in the styles, the styling attributes inside the H1 are striked out. That is, those rules are cancelled or in a way overridden. This is because the class selector has higher priority over the element selector. Similarly, if I have a condition like this where I have defined an ID as well as the class on the same element and I have defined different backgrounds for them, now when you look at the output, you can see the paragraph with the ID is getting priority in spite of having class defined, and the other paragraph is accessed with the element selector. Again, in the developer tool, you can see the class and element selectors are striked out. Because the ID selector has higher priority compared to the class selector. Now, if I also add inline style to this paragraph, let's say style is equal to background. I just give some value in the RGB. Let's save this. Now you see the priority is changed as it gives priority to inline style more than even the ID selector and of course the class selector as well. Thus, every selector has its place and priority defined. The CSS specificity or priority of selector goes this way. Inline has the higher priority, ID selector, then class selector and the element selector. After that, we have the group selector and then the universal selector. So in a way, you see that inline style has higher priority unless there is one option, and let me talk about that. Well, if you still want to give more importance to a value or a property despite their specificity, then there is a rule called exclamation important. This rule will override all the previous styling rules applied on that property and will give more importance to it. So let's say if I want this class selector styling to be displayed on the paragraph, then I'll simply add exclamation important here like this. And you see the inline style is overridden and the class selector is given higher priority just because you have given the exclamation important. Remember, exclamation important, that is important is not a very good way when you are applying the styling because it breaks the normal execution sequence. And sometimes it is very difficult to find out some issues with CSS if you have used important. Better not to practice this, but there are situations when you have a lot of CSS applied. In some cases, when nothing works and you want to force the CSS to apply specific rule, certainly you can go with exclamation important. So now let's talk about questions. The first question is what is CSS specificity and what is the sequence? So we have already discussed that it's all about priority, especially when the rules are clashing. If they are not clashing, you will not have any problem, right? Let's say in H1, you have color in element selector and you have font size in class selector, then there is no clash between the rules. So both of the rules will be applied. But when there is a clash of rules, then there is a priority defined by CSS, and that's what CSS specificity is. The next question is what is the purpose of exclamation important? So basically this important makes the property as a highest priority regardless where it is used, whether it is in class selector or anywhere. The moment it becomes an important, that means it is important. It will have highest priority. But as I mentioned, not a good practice to use important unless you are being forced to use it. While developing websites, CSS will always be a necessity, but along with that, maintaining the CSS when building a website is also quite important. And it is always a best practice to get ahead of maintenance by starting with a baseline. To do this, we as developers define a CSS reset file to prevent any inconsistencies across different browsers while developing websites. So what is a CSS reset file? Well, all the browsers have default rules with properties and values applied to all the pages before loading files. A CSS reset file targets all the rules that our different browsers apply defaults to and reset them to their minimum possible value. The ideal goal of the reset style sheet is to reduce browsers' inconsistencies in things like default line heights, margins, font sizes, padding, etc. Now this is required because, as I said, every browser has its own default user agent style sheet that it uses to make unstyled websites appear more legible. But many times it creates havoc with the defined style sheets provided by the developer. With all that said, let's look at what a simple reset file looks like. And to begin with, let me create an HTML file. Inside the body, I'll give h1. Let me define a form and giving few inputs like text, mobile, URL, email, date, range, color and button. I'll apply some basic styling to them. For division, I will set margin 10 pixels and center align the elements. And for body, I'll add font size 12 pixels and padding of 20 pixels. Now if you observe the output, you can see there is some default margin and padding applied on the document. This might cause some positional error when we further apply different positional styling to the document. Now to avoid this, we define a reset file. Using the universal selector, in most cases, it's better to define a reset file using a universal selector, or you can always use element selectors to reset them individually. So inside the universal selector, I'll set the margin and padding to 0, and you can observe the output. All the default and meaningless spaces are nullified. By doing this, we are removing the default styles of the browser for more consistency. Now everyone has their own perspective regarding which CSS reset file to use, as there are various approaches for defining a reset file, as you can see here.